to the Palouse Conservation District for having me, and I also applaud your efforts for presenting this material. It's a tough topic for all of us to hear and to think about. I think it's one of the most challenging ones to get an audience, to draw an audience into, but it's probably, in this day and age, probably one of the most critical ones. So thank you all for being a part of it and for making it happen tonight. So I'm looking on two screens, so I apologize for looking away a little bit during the presentation. It always seems like it sticks in the beginning. Let's try that. There we go. It's like I have to click on something else to get it to go forward first. Okay, I'll just give you a little bit of background about my work that I do, Horses for Clean Water. So as we said in the beginning, I'm an educator. I work with small acreage livestock owners developing educational materials, so classes, farm tours, workshops, different consultations. We've got a lot of those materials on our website. And all of the work that I do is about sustainable ways of keeping horses and livestock. And the bottom line for most of the work is clean water, is that we're trying to find ways to take care of our animals so that we're not having runoff from mud and manure or from overgrazed pastures that gets into the surface water or even to the groundwater and can cause bigger issues for the ecosystem or the natural world around us. So Horses for Clean Water is about win-win-win ways of keeping livestock that's going to benefit everybody. Hopefully animal health, chore efficiency, productivity of your property, aesthetics of your property and your neighborhood. It's going to save you money because you're having hopefully less vet bills and more productive pastures and that sort of thing, as well as conserving our natural resources. So Firewise tonight, what we're going to be talking about is some different ways to address the issue of wildfire on livestock properties. And what I want to mention first is how I came about doing this topic. I live now in southwestern Idaho, which is a pretty dry area. But I'm from Western Washington, the Puget Sound area. And over there, I worked for conservation districts, specifically for the King Conservation District. And that's where I first started and first was asked to develop educational materials on Firewise for livestock owners. And you would just, until now, you would really never think of it in Western Washington. But the thing is, as we've seen in a few years, if you get a dry year, that buildup of duff can just be very volatile and increase the probability of wildfire. So because I had that background of developing those educational materials, when I moved to Idaho, I was super conscious of being Firewise and looking at the properties in that, with that eye in mind, or that viewpoint in mind. And we'll talk about that as we go along tonight. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about why wildfires are increasing in our American West, kind of giving you the perspective on the situation, a brief perspective. And I'm going to talk about what experts consider the two main causes for wildfire, as well as we're going to talk about reducing wildfire risk. We're going to spend a lot of time on that. And that's primarily creating defensible space. So we'll be talking about the components of that, as well as evacuation planning and Firewise resources. And, you know, it's not like a definitive coverage of all of this, but everybody but there's so many components to Firewise, but so it's going to be the tip of the iceberg. All right, so starting off, climate change. I think that it's pretty well established that we are beginning to experience the effects of climate change, and all of the models worldwide are predicting climate change. And what comes along with that is hotter, drier summers, warmer winters, droughts, more weather extremes, wetter winters and springs with less snow. And all of that, unfortunately, points to an increase in the possibility of wildfires. And wildfires cause a lot of problems, not just some of us potentially losing our homes as being the worst, but can cause other things like affecting recreation and tourism and agriculture. And post fires can also mean mud flows and landslides, all of which we've seen across the United States. And the U.S. Drought Monitor last summer, said that pretty much most of the American West was experiencing what we call a mega drought, which means it's a severe drought. And I was just talking to a climatologist yesterday from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And he was saying the drought in the American West has really been about 20 years, which I didn't even realize. So it's easy for us to think that wildfires only happen to other people. I find this to be the case in a lot of situations. For example, like when we were looking for property here 12 years ago when we moved here, and I'd ask people what their wildfire preparedness plans were, and they would tell me that they were just hoping that they didn't have a wildfire. And as unfortunately we see and know that can lead to tragic consequences. So some of the fires in the Pacific Northwest, just highlighting, there's been so many, but just to highlight a few. This one was in my friend's property on rangeland, which can be similar to dry land, agriculture land. And the two people that you can see up in the hillside there were BLM individuals that were standing there getting ready to tell Karen they said, when we wave our arms, that's when you have to leave. So this map is from the BLM office in the Boise district. And it's a map of all the wildfires from the dates there, 1970 to 2007. So it's a little bit dated, but you can still see how most of the wildfires were in the American West, and most of them were in southern Idaho, but also in Oregon and Washington and California. And I got a lot of funding from the BLM office to produce this PowerPoint actually that we have right now. So here is a map from NOAA. Again, that's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And this is a map from 2000 to 2018. And that's compilation of all the wildfires out west. So you can see that things have just increased since the last map. Maybe I'll go back to this one. It's increased and spread out. By increasing, I mean it's gone across almost all of the American West, and probably still targeting Idaho quite a bit. But as we know, California and Oregon and Nevada, and then this spring, Arizona, New Mexico. National Geographic reported that in 2018, 10 million acres of land burned in the prior year, 2017. And yeah, it's the history of it of wildfires in the American West is pretty frightening. 2013, the largest wildfire in the United States was not far from us. 2014 was the same way. It was the Soda Fire. And that one we could see from our property. Since I'm also a journalist, I was able to go to the press briefings for it, and 300,000 acres is just beyond comprehension how big some of these fires get. Wenatchee and Western Washington or Eastern Washington seems to burn every year and have a lot of substantial fires. This fire in British Columbia, which didn't used to have fires, last year, one of my forester friends put this slide together and shared it with me. But this is in British Columbia, as I say, this town in April of last year. And then after it was wiped out by a wildfire in July. And the thing about us as livestock owners is that most of us live in rural areas. We live in the fringes, kind of between urban and rural and ag land. And unfortunately, these are the places that are often hit the hardest with wildfires. So when we have horses and livestock and we have the threat of a wildfire, we need to take action quickly, because it's a little more complicated dealing with our horses. We can't just load them in the back of the truck like you can dogs and other things. This picture was from Colorado Springs, from the Black Forest Fire in 2013, and that one actually took off through neighborhoods. And the same for this one is also Colorado Springs. So when you have horses and livestock, being proactive is your safest plan. You know, if you look at this picture, I can't imagine what it would be like to have to try to evacuate your animals in this manner. You can see in the rear view mirror how huge that fire is, and the lady is riding a horse, and she's not even able to have a halter and a lead on the mare. She's just hoping that, you know, obviously, I guess she's just hoping that the mare and foal will follow her along. And I can only imagine that's her husband driving or another family member driving the pickup. This is actually from Australia. I did a lot of my Firewise research in Australia. I actually was in Australia and met with Firewise experts there. They call them bushfires. And in Australia, they're pretty proactive in that they require people who live in the bush to have a Firewise plan. Okay, so let's talk about how fires can start, how they can be ignited. And experts say that wildfires start in two ways. It can be directly by lightning or an ignition source on your property. And this is pretty interesting. So this is a map that the BLM gave me, the Bureau of Land Management, and it covers 3 states. It's Idaho, Oregon, and Nevada. And these are lightning strikes, and every little blue hash mark is a lightning strike in one night. And so each one of those has the potential of starting a fire. So lightning is incredible. I was on a trail ride, a midnight trail ride one summer when it was a full moon. And we went up high on this hill in rangeland, and there was a dry lightning storm, and we could see fires starting way off on the other side of the valley. You know, but it looked like the end of the world, and those, you could see the flames from them, and it was pretty frightening. And it's pretty amazing that how powerful lightning is. Or fire can spread indirectly, and experts have mixed feelings on which is more likely to start a fire, but indirectly is a very common way of fires spreading. So what this is wind-blown embers, the sparks basically from a fire, travel, and they can travel a mile, they can even travel 2 miles if the wind is right, and they land on buildings or anything combustible nearby and ignite it. So we're going to talk about ways to reduce risk of wildfire from sparks. So yeah, that's just, this is another example. This is again in Colorado Springs. So the fire actually was several miles from this barn, but the sparks blew in and ignited the hay in the barn, and it was a wooden barn as well. So it caught the whole barn on fire. And when you have a fire like this again is an Australian bushfire, but the magnitude of that and the heat, the amount of sparks generated from that is going to be, you know, catastrophic. But fortunately, there are ways that we can reduce our risks. Experts show us all the time where wildfires have happened and burn right up to houses that have reduced their wildfire risk through creating defensible space that we're going to talk about. And the fires literally stop. So we're going to talk about ways to create defensible space and reduce the risk of wildfire on your property. And then we're also going to talk about evacuation planning. Okay, so defensible space, what it is and how do we create it? So defensible space is the area that you create around your house or your barn or whatever is important most important to you on your property, so that there is going to be nothing in there that burns, so that if a fire comes to your place, it will stop when it gets to that. Or if you're lucky enough to have resources available in your area where you have emergency management people fighting the fire, they can come and get into that defensible space with your house or your barn behind them and fight the fire going forward. So that's why we call it defensible space. So first thing to understand with defensible space is what we call the 3 legs of the fire triangle. This is what fire experts talk about. So to have a fire, you need 3 things. You need oxygen, heat, and fuel. And if you think about it, there's very little we can do about the oxygen or the heat, but there is something we can do about the fuel. So the oxygen is like if you have high winds, like the Santa Ana winds that they have in California. The heat is if you have hot weather, hot, dry weather, and then the fuel can be a variety of things. And we're going to talk about the fire fuels portion. All right, so you want to create a defensible space around anything that you value on your livestock property. So this means it's going to be the area around a structure that you maintain and that you design so that the risk of fire in that area is reduced. And it's going to help keep potential wildfire from spreading across your place and into those high value areas. And then, as I mentioned, it also provides emergency management people access and a safer point to defend your property. So here is a drawing that I had created to kind of signify horse property or livestock property and how defensible space might look on a livestock property. So zone 1, the whole space should add up to be about 100 feet. And zone 1 is the first 30 feet. That's closest to your house or your barn or whatever you want to create defensible space around. Zone 2 is the next 30 feet out from that. And then zone 3 is 40 feet. And we're going to talk about the different things that you can put in each of those areas or that you want to eliminate. And we'll start, of course, with zone 1. A lot of it has to do with landscaping, but there's other materials as well that we're going to talk about. So as far as landscaping, you want to keep any plants in there. You want to, you want to keep them low, lean, and green. So that means that you want plants that are ground covers. They should not have a lot of branches or leaves that accumulate, and they should be very green plants. You don't want anything that's dry, and I'm going to show you some examples. And less is more. So you kind of want to have sparse landscaping if you can. You want to avoid plants that are going to be fire hazards and that will burn easily, like juniper and pines. And you want to stick to the plants that have a high moisture content in their leaf and a lower fuel volume when they're dormant. So I'll show you a few examples. So these are plants these are drought tolerant xeric plants, and there's going to be different plants for your area that are going to also be available. And so I really encourage you to look into Firewise gardens if you have them in your area, or xeric gardens if there's any examples of those in your area. So you want plants with a low oil or resin content, a high moisture content. They grow close to the ground in a compact form. A lot of types of plants have high soap or salt content. And then you also want plants that have green stems instead of being brown. So deciduous trees are generally more fire resistant than evergreens because evergreens have more sap in them that tends to be more flammable. Let's see some other examples. And you also want it, so again, we're talking about zone 1. So that's the first 30 feet around your house or your barn. And so you want to keep anything that's highly flammable to a minimum, or you want to not have it in there at all. So this is also what people call the drip zone or the irrigation zone. So your household hose and watering system can reach all these plants and keep them green. So you want to keep your lawns green and any of the other plants that you're using there. Just a few examples. These are not like native plants, but this is phlox, and it's a great one. Another great one is soapwort. These plants can be pretty kinnick, which is a native plant for Washington. Lamb's ear. So the furry plants are Firewise plants, and they tend to be fire resistant. Also, these are a few native plants. So the one in the upper left is a primrose. And I imagine that you have different kinds of primroses that grow in the Palouse area, as well as penstemons, yarrows, and sedums. And these are all good because they're low to the ground and they have a little higher water content in their leaves. So let's look at zone 2. So some examples of what you would have in zone 2 are maybe just a little bit taller plants for your landscaping. So vines, honeysuckles, hops, black-eyed Susans, penstemons, Wild blue flax is a native plant, and it's drought tolerant and is also fire resistant. And echinacea is as well, which is purple cone flower. And so is yucca. The one on the right here is honeysuckle. That's a native honeysuckle. And this is the penstemon on the left and echinacea on the right. And low-growing sumac is a great one that's Firewise. It doesn't get very tall. It stays very green, and its leaves tend to be waxy and thicker as far as having more moisture content. And zone 3, so you can start adding in trees here, but what you want to do is what we call parking them out. So that means that you want them so they don't touch each other. And so if you have trees that touch each other, you might want to consider talking with an arborist or a landscaper or somebody from the conservation district who can help you with deciding which trees to take out and if you should take them out. But when you park them out, the branches don't touch each other. So that means if you got a crown fire, it couldn't go from crown to crown and spread more. It'd help reduce the spread that way. So other plants for zone 3, any trees or shrubs should be limbed up and thinned out. You should try to rake up leaves off of the ground, pick up branches. Aspen, mock orange, snowberry are good ones for this zone 3, as are currants, raspberries, willows, hawthorn, mountain ash, and maybe Jared or some of the other conservation district staff might have native plant recommendations for you. And this is mock orange, which is a Firewise plant, a good one that would be good for zone 2 or 3. Snowberry, zone 2 or 3. Desert willow, zone 2 or 3. So hopefully that just gives you some ideas of landscaping and what you want to have in those different zones. Let's talk about some other things for reducing risks. If you are building any part of your property, there's different things that you can do as far as siting structures. So you want to avoid siting any structures at the edge of a bluff or the top of the hill, because these areas act like a chimney and it sucks the fire up. So anything that's on top of a hill, like this house here, is like fire bait. These hillsides here in the Boise foothills are all cheatgrass and dried weeds by the middle of June even. And if you would happen to get a lightning strike or a wildfire, it could easily just wick right up the side of that hill like a chimney and put this house at risk. So if you are building, you want to think about choosing materials that are not going to be flammable as much as possible. So we built this building on our property, our guest barn, and I chose all, or as much as possible, Firewise materials. So we have a metal roof, and then we have, we used recycled drilling pipe for the posts and for the fencing. So pretty much, you know, everything on the outside, I guess you'd say, is all metal and non-flammable. So if you can think about that kind of approach for building anything on your property, that'll be helpful. This is an example that I like to show. I have a couple of these. I think I only have this one in this picture, but in this presentation, of wildfires that came right up to houses but didn't catch the house on fire because two things. One, they have metal roofs. Even though they have a wood house, they have metal roof surfaces. And then the other thing is that they've got all green landscaping right around the perimeter of their house. So they have watered pastures and plants right next to their house. So another Firewise idea for zone 1 is to clean out the gutters and downspouts on your house. I've taken a lot of Firewise training classes, and at the end of the class, they send us out to go and walk through landowners' properties, and it's crazy what you see, like piles of firewood, even like small piles that people intend to come back and pick up, but they're leaning next to the building, or you see the roofs full of leaves or pine needles, and all you need is a spark from someplace nearby, and it flies in and it lands in that kindling and it catches it on fire. And if that happens, even if you have a metal roof, the underpinning is all wood, like you saw on our guest barn. And if you've got a fire sitting at the edge of the metal roof, it's very likely to catch the wood structure underneath and your whole barn. So you want to clean out gutters and downspouts. Think about any kind of debris that's collecting around the base of your house and your barn, and walk around it now before fire season is into full swing. Fencing choices. The picture on the left I purchased from a photographer in California in a fire. And until that time, I had not even thought about PVC fencing and how potentially dangerous it could be in a fire, because for one thing, it could melt and then your horses and animals and livestock are loose. And for another, the fumes from it would be deadly. So you want to avoid wood or vinyl. What firefighting experts see with wood is that the wood fencing acts like a wick, like a fuse on dynamite, really. Like it pulls the fire along the fence line up to the barn or the shelter structure and catches it on fire. So even if the fire wasn't at the barn, it's going to potentially draw it in. So instead, what you want to try to have or consider is any kind of metal fencing. So panel fencing, or like the welded pipe fencing that we have on our guest barn. Those are some good Firewise options for people that live in fire areas that are prone to wildfires. So you want to also think about other flammables around your property, and the list, it can potentially be huge. One of my favorite stories really from the BLM was one of their wildfire experts was telling me about the doormats made out of coconut fiber. And he said they're basically like kindling. And he said maybe a person even has Firewise landscaping, but they've got coconut doormats in front of their house, and a spark comes up and lands on that doormat, and it just ignites the whole thing. And he said what people should do instead is take them, cut them into strips, and put them in their camping box and take them on camping trips as fire starter. So you want to think about anything, wooden furniture, anything that you've got in front of your house that might be flammable. And instead, you want to replace it with metal furniture and non-flammable materials like that. Fire breaks are huge in preparing for a wildfire and wildfire season. And there's many different ways to create fire breaks. One of the best and easiest is just plowing like a 10 to 12 foot wide swath of land. I was just coming back from Pendleton, Oregon today, actually, and I passed more than one farm that was putting in what I'm pretty sure was a fire break between the land next to the road and where their crops started or their rangeland started. And 12 feet wide is what the Bureau of Land Management recommends. So there's other things, though, that we can use as fire breaks other than just bare ground. We can use driveways, lawns, patios, parking areas. I'll show you an example of that. Inorganic mulches, so that's like rock mulches. Fences that are made of non-flammable material like rock or brick or cement. Yeah, so also water features like pools, ponds, streams. So in this picture, this is on our property. We have this kind of road area that can act as a fire break. We have the irrigation ditch that can act as a fire break. We also store our hay away from our barn. So if the hay would catch on fire, it's not going to pull everything else in, hopefully. So those are just some ideas for fire breaks. Here's a list of lots of options for fire breaks. I think maybe we mentioned most of these. Areas where vegetation's been thinned or replaced with less flammable plants. In Australia, they actually encourage that you have a pasture that's overgrazed, and they use that as a fire break and then also as a place to put livestock if a wildfire breaks out. Here's a parking lot. They probably didn't create it as a fire break, but I thought it was an excellent example. This property is next to some rangeland and where it could potentially be wildfires. And he has this big gravel parking lot, which works totally as a fire break. Here's an example of a fire break that the BLM put in when there was a fire. So there was a fire on the right-hand side. Farmers and the BLM went in and put in miles and miles of a fire break. And so when the fire burned up to this road, this dirt area, it burned itself out. And that would also be, even though I'm talking about rangeland, this would be the same principle you'd want to use for dryland ag areas. Grazing goats. So these are super popular in Boise and in the Treasure Valley, and they're used by cities and by the fire districts, and they put them on the foothills all the way through summer and continuing into the end of the summer to keep grazing down cheatgrass and other dried weeds. And they're very popular with the cities here. And you can, I've seen other places where they use livestock other than goats. Those boar goats tend to be pretty good at this sort of things, the white ones with the brown heads. But I've seen people use horses when the grass was green and graze it down that way, as well as cattle. And the BLM uses cattle a lot to try to reduce the amount of fuel load buildup. The other thing you want to do is think about clearing dead weeds and brush and debris that collects along your fence line. So maybe you have a metal fence that's not flammable, like in this picture here. That's one of our fences that is a wire fence. But we get tumbleweeds here, and the tumbleweeds just collect along the fence line like it's almost solid. And I have seen wildfires where they hit one end of that string of tumbleweed, and it just goes, it looks like a windshield wiper. It goes so fast. It catches on so quickly. So If you do have debris that's collecting in your fence lines, you want to clear that. So most of your evergreens are going to be flammable. In particular, juniper is super flammable. This was our place when we moved in, and I realized that that was not a good idea, because if you have a wildfire, it's on the ground, a ground fire, it comes towards your property, it hits that juniper and it just flies up it. And then composite roofs are really pretty good as far as not being flammable, but you have the flashing around the edge and then underneath the roof that are wood. And when you have the, say you had a ground fire coming across here, it hits juniper, it goes up, and then it catches all across the roof and your house is gone. So we took all of those evergreens out. The other thing you don't want to do is use wood landscaping material, because again, this is just like having kindling, and that is going to burn if you have a wildfire, and you particularly don't want it around your house. You want instead to have rock mulch around your property in that first 30 feet. So a lot of times people are concerned about propane tanks. The different trainings that I've taken say that propane tanks aren't really your concern. But what would be the concern here is the wood fence. And so if you had a wildfire and it caught this wood fence, it would just pull it right up to the house. And this is our house again. So what we did was we made a break in the fence. So we have either a gate or a section of the fence that we can pull out. So we could, if we were home and there was a wildfire, we could open the gate on this side, and on the other side, we could pull that section of fence. It's about a 6 or 10 foot section of fence that we can pull out and hopefully provide a fire break that way. So wood roofs are not recommended. Any kind of the shingle roofs are not recommended. You can see here how this property is trying to water it to reduce the risk of wildfire. So if you have cisterns or pumps, I've had a lot of people tell me that they've been able to figure out how to rig up their cisterns so that they can do things like this picture and water their roofs and the structures on their property to help reduce the risk. You know, it's not going to run for very long, but at least if you can get some water on these surfaces, that's going to help you. Okay, let's talk about how to prepare for emergency evacuation. And again, all of this is just the tip of the iceberg, but these are important things to be addressing and begin thinking about. So preparing to evacuate is actually something that you do now, and not when we think that there's a wildfire potential in the area. You want to think about it ahead of time. And you don't want to have to end up like these people who are having to walk their animals out of a fire area. So you have to decide in advance which animals you're going to evacuate and make sure that they're suitably trained for transport. At the class I was just at a pasture and grazing management conference in Pendleton, and one of the instructors yesterday was talking about low stress handling for livestock and how important it is and how it's the gold standard in managing livestock these days. They did a demonstration of it, and the instructor talked about how he saw, and a friend of his who had a wildfire on their property, and she moved some cows. She thought the other cows were safe. This was in Eastern Oregon. And after she got the first set of cows moved, she came back to see that the first set were actually in harm's way. And she got on a four-wheeler, and because she had done low stress handling with her cattle, she was able to long trot those cows out of that area for 2 hours, is what he said, and get them out of harm's way. And they were not, you know, unduly stressed or trying to bolt or take off. They were used to being handled and used to non-stressful techniques and body language. So they trusted her. So you want to think about that in terms of what kind of animals and livestock you have and how you would evacuate them if there was a fire. And what everybody tells me who's had to evacuate is that you want to go early and not wait. I just taught this class last month in Western Oregon, where 2 years ago they had tons of wildfires. And the people in that class said they didn't have to, some of them not only evacuated once or twice, but some of them evacuated 3 times. And they said their best advice is to go early and get your animals as far away as possible. You don't want to be like these poor folks in Colorado that were trying to evacuate from the Colorado Black Forest fire. So you got to practice when it's chill and when your animals are chill, and not when it's an emergency. And there's even training. They have training around here a lot for dealing, you know, because if your barn was on fire and fire emergency management people come in, they're not going to look like us. They're going to look like Darth Vader and sound like Darth Vader. So you may want to consider training your animals so that they can be handled in that kind of a situation. So the party line is that if you are in an active fire area and you're evacuating, you're supposed to remove all synthetic materials. This is a guideline for Australia, actually. And they have research that shows that leaving nylon halters or fly sheets or fly masks on actually causes more problems, because if those sparks land on your animals, it's going to melt, you know, and burn to the animal. And it would be a lot better if the spark just landed on them versus melted nylon or plastic. So what you're supposed to use instead is leather or cloth or rope halters, and don't put anything else on them. I mean, it's a little counterintuitive. You'd think you'd want something so that the smoke or so that the sparks didn't get in their eyes, but that is state-of-the-art information. Then you want to predetermine as much as possible where you're going to take your animals. This picture just spells disaster. It's a recipe waiting to happen. There are so many things wrong with this picture. For one thing, the fencing doesn't look stable. For another, the people in the picture don't look safe. You know, they're trying to crowd these horses into, I assume, a trailer, and all of them don't even have halters or properly apply, you know, halters aren't put on the horses correctly. And there's so much that's dangerous about this situation. So instead, what you want to do is predetermine ahead of time where you're going to take your animals. I've also heard people say, well, I would just take them to the fairgrounds or here, like to the Idaho Horse Park. I've asked at the Idaho Horse Park, for example, if there was a wildfire, could people take their animals there? And they said absolutely not, because they're not set up for that kind of thing. They don't have insurance for that. They don't have staff for that. So you need to make sure that it's going to be a place where you're allowed to take the animals. And you maybe need to have a conversation now instead of, you know, when it gets to be a push comes to shove. So probably the best thing is a friend's livestock property that's going to be properly suited for your animals. But there's also livestock or stockyards or sales yards, fairgrounds, showgrounds, racetracks, parks. Again, you want to make sure that you have permission ahead of time to take animals there. So the sheriff is going to be the bottom line in deciding. Your county sheriff is the emergency management person, and that's who you want to be listening to as far as whether it's time to go or not. And this was a friend of mine who was trying to figure out, she was in harm's way for a potential wildfire, and she was trying to decide if she should go, and was talking to the county sheriff. What you don't want to do is turn your animals loose, particularly for horses. So horses, as we know, and equines are herd animals, and they've been trained to look to us for as their herd leader. And too often what happens is that people just turn their horses loose, and the horses congregate on roads. They congregate around other other emergency management officials, and they end up causing more problems. They block the vehicles that are, you know, potentially going to be able to get in there to fight fires. So you don't want to turn your horses loose. And I have had many emergency management officials tell me about scenarios of this happening. Yeah, in fact, in the presentation that I gave in Oregon last month, they said so many animals were cut loose and on the roads that they were a huge hazard to evacuation personnel, and then they also were a hazard to the people who were trying to evacuate. So, and then some of the horses were caught in barbed wire fencing and were panicking, and so it's never a good idea. And even though your horse is not on your property, you're still liable for any damage that they cause. So if somebody hits your horse with a car, you're liable there. So what the party line is that you're supposed to create a fire safe area on your property and this is for when evacuation isn't possible, and you're going to put your animals in this fire safe area. And so what that is any large area on your property, hopefully with metal fencing. It could be like a dry sand arena. You don't want it to be an arena with wood footing. It could be a big confinement area, a dry lot kind of area. It could be an overgrazed pasture. And if you have time, you can put food and water in metal containers, non-flammable containers in the middle of that area. You know, cattle hopefully are ID'd, and hopefully other livestock are ID'd already, but horses aren't necessarily. So, you know, if you're having to turn your horses out onto rangeland or someplace like that to escape the fire, you should consider, or if you're evacuating and you have to take them to a facility, you may not be able to get back right away to you know, somebody else might be taking care of them, or you might be hauling somebody else's horses. So you want to try to ID your horses prior to something happening. So microchip is a good idea. Writing your cell phone number on a hoof with a magic marker, or with a grease pen on a hip. There's bands that you can get that will Velcro onto an ankle. I've also heard a lot of people say that it was really effective braiding a tag into the mane of a horse. So resources. I have a lot of resources I'm going to email to you. They are materials that I've developed with funding from these different agencies that are wildfire experts. And so I make them available to people for free. And they've been used widely. They were used by many government agencies in California this past fire season. And I've gotten a lot of acolytes on them. So I encourage you to take advantage of them, read through them, share them. They go into more detail than what we're able to do here. But there's different websites that are a good resource. This is a USDA website that has a lot of educational information. Also NIFC, which is the National Interagency Fire Center. That's the fire center for all of North America. They have a good website that has educational information along with tracking. There's also apps. I have one on my phone, a wildfire app that I have all the time. There's Facebook lists that people create, that you can create with your neighbors next door as well, and other kinds of community lists and apps that people create in an area. And again, the advice that everybody says who's been through a wildfire is when you hear ready, set, go, go early. And another resource that I really want to encourage everybody to check out is any Firewise gardens in your area. So you can Google that and then go see them. And you'll see that they're attractive and you'll get different ideas for plants. So don't forget to check out my website for all the materials that we have available, including different kinds of tip sheets. And here's the QR code so you can sign up for our newsletter if you would like. And that's it.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Alayne, for that in-depth presentation and sharing all your knowledge. That was truly wonderful. Thank you. We're going to turn it over to Garrett Lasavita to do a brief regional overview of some programs that we offer through the district. So Garrett, I'll turn it over to you. You can start sharing your screen.
Great. Thank you, Jody. So we're just going to talk a little bit about the Washington State Burn Program. And I don't know if everyone's familiar with it. And just kind of get that underway, and then how you can manage your livestock and lands after a burn. So for Washington State, these are some of the things that you do not need a permit for and what you do need a permit for. And I would say most of the burn program permits that we distribute are probably large acre crop burning, so post-harvest field and crop residue. And for especially Whitman County, this is a huge liability in why we have burns. Okay, so this is a great resource. This is called the Drought Monitor, and every week they update. You just Google like Washington State Drought Monitor. Every week they update and show you what the drought status is for your area. And you can just kind of zoom in on your state or your area. And you can see for Whitman County, regardless of all the rain that we've had this year, this is valid from May 24th. They update it every Thursday on a weekly basis. So it's always kind of like 1 week behind where you are, but not too far behind from where we are today. So as of May 24th, we are still considered abnormally dry for the county. So just something to consider going into summer. I know last summer was much more dry, but there are still fire risks that can happen. Burn season typically starts between like May and September. So just trying to keep everyone prepared this year. This is a quick map of wildfires that happened in 2021 and 2020. I know you can't really see all of them because some of them are pretty small, just little speckles here and there, but you can see the really large ones that happened outside Lewiston last year that caused pretty severe fire damage. And then in the middle, you can see I believe that's the Malden fire right there. So this is pretty up to date, and that's from Department of Ecology from last year. Okay, so a little bit about wildfires. According to the Department of Natural Resources, as of last year, we had over 800 fires in just Washington state last year, but 61% of them were caused by humans. Of that 61%, 253 of them were debris burns, which would classify as agricultural burning. So that's like a quarter, a little bit more than a quarter of everything that was starting wildfires last year was agricultural burns. And then the other half, another 150 were miscellaneous, and that can be from driving hot engines and vehicles through dry brush, utility lines, dragging chains, etc., anything that can cause friction. But only 30 of 836 fires were naturally caused. You should also be noted that this 836 fires is about double of the 10-year average. And we had that in 1 year. So not a great source. So in Whitman County, we have 14 fire districts. Most of them are locally placed. Like in the town of Palouse, there's one in Colfax, there's one in Steptoe, there's one in Garfield, Rosalia, St. John, etc. All of these fire districts have information about our burn permits. So when somebody is burning for a burn permit, they should be letting your fire district know, and they should be telling them like when they're burning. And we have also submitted a map of where they're supposed to be burning. So if you have any, I don't know, if you're just looking for information, or if you see smoke and you want to know where it's coming from, you should be able to call your burn district, and they should be able to tell you where that fire is, like hypothetically. And then if it's a legal fire, provided somebody actually got a permit and put it in the record. But I would encourage you to also reach out to your burn districts and local community members as a type of neighborhood watch if you see something that is maybe burning that maybe shouldn't be burning, especially on very windy days. I have gotten calls in the past from clients being like, oh, can I burn today even though it's very windy? No, please don't burn on windy days. That's not a burn day, and burn days have to be authorized by the state and the county. So these are just a resource if you are interested in where potential burns could be near you this summer, or you could reach out to your conservation district. We also know. Okay, so what can you do about fires? I know Alayne touched on this with fire breaks, but in agricultural fields, you can also burn a fire break to create kind of like a space in between viable fuel sources, or a lot of the farmers around here will disc their fields. Disking your field is fairly effective. It creates kind of like a dead zone in between. Generally, they're between 30 and 50 feet wide, but on the Palouse, we do have a slope to consider. And because fire travels a little bit faster uphill than downhill, you should be using a larger width when you're disking, like so about 50 feet. And you should be doing that on like intervals, because fire can jump the hill and jump the disc. So something to consider if that is a resource that you're willing to utilize to fireproof your property and your perimeter. Okay. So considerations for fire management. For grazing, it's probably not great to graze your cattle right on the fire. Most of the resources that I found and I've read through scientific studies have said that you're supposed to wait until the first growing season. However, that can definitely take a little bit depending on how long and what type of grass you've put down. So a lot of other resources have also said to wait 2 growing seasons to like fully restock your field. If you're going to put your livestock back on, they do recommend having other forages and feeds available, because there's just not going to be anything for them to graze right away. Allow for cover and nesting habitat to reestablish, allow for your plants to come back, and you should also base the number of your livestock on the forage available, and you should also consider postponing grazing or potentially culling your livestock if necessary. So Maybe just don't put them right on right away and let everything regenerate. It's not totally bad for fire, but we'll go into what types of grasses do best just in a bit. Oh, and one last thing on that last slide. Put up cameras or take photos over time from the same point. That way you can see a change in like the grass or the landscape over like the next year, and you can see how things are coming back. That's just like a helpful reminder, because I know everyone thinks they'll remember, but I never do. And it's hard to see that change over slight periods. So there's a couple different grasses that we generally have on the loose. Some of them are annual, some are perennial, and obviously they all respond very differently from fire. So they're going to grow back a little differently if your grazing fields have been extinguished or at least partially burnt up. Annual grasses produce very little dormant seeds. So when a fire comes through, you've essentially annihilated 80 to 90% of their viable stock that year, also depending on the temperature of the fire. But for the most part, annual grasses are pretty close to the surface, and there's a really good chance that they will be burnt. So you will have to replant your annuals, which is generally barley grass, smooth brome, things like that. All things your cattle and your livestock enjoy, but they're just not going to come back right away. So it would be good to replant those in the fall. Perennials, they do come back every year, but it also depends on how well established they are. If they haven't been very well established for a year or two, there's a pretty good chance that they might not come back. But if they're fairly well established, it depends on how deep their root system goes. But for the most part, they'll probably come back. So things like blue bunch wheatgrass, Idaho fescue, and any type of legumes like clover or hairy vetch, other things that your cattle like, they have a pretty good chance of coming back in the next year. You just got to be a little patient, that's all, because the weeds will take over. In terms of putting your livestock back on the property, they say wait at least 4 months, but ideally 7, because you're going to compress the ground. You're going to trample anything that might be coming up. You're going to rip up whatever might be coming up. But then there's also health benefits from keeping your livestock off. You probably don't want them inhaling all that ash all the time. There was a very tentative study from UC Davis in 2018 that said like eating some ash won't impact their health too much, but they also said that it probably needs more research. Their study sample was pretty large, but it's just a new thing that people are starting to consider right now. So there's not a whole lot of data. They did say that breathing in the ash could impact their lung health, especially if you don't have a water source. So things to consider, supplemental protein, and if maybe half of your field hasn't been burned, trying a rotational grazing along with supplemental protein, but it's gonna take a little bit. You can't just throw them back on. In terms of water and wildfires, ooh, why is this green? That's crazy. So a lot of people in Whitman County, I know, have open water sources like creeks and things that they utilize for their livestock. But if you've had a wildfire in the area, those creeks can really hold a lot of dirt, ash, soil, mineral, proteins. And especially since we're around agricultural areas, you have to think of all the fertilizer and pesticide runoff that's coming from the soil and into those water sources. And you probably do not want your animals ingesting all of those things at once. So a good rule of thumb is that your water should be cool and clear, and especially during a burn season or hot weather and just arid landscapes in general, your livestock is going to need a little bit more water than what you would previously have rationed or anticipated for them. Part of that is because the water can clear ash from their throat, so then they can like breathe a little bit easier. So essentially they're trying to clear up their own airways and like prevent themselves from feeling congested, but it also helps with not creating permanent lung damage. Ash and soil can blow into or wash into dams, creeks, streams, and rivers. So if you have any of those on your property, it would be a good thing to get them tested before you have your livestock go into them. especially because we had mentioned all of this fertilizer and things go in. That's just a breeding ground for algae and cyanobacteria, which can be pretty noxious and at times fatal for your livestock if they're drinking the cyanobacteria. Most of the time, livestock are pretty smart. They're turned off by like bad smells, bad color, bad texture. But if they're desperate and that's the only water source, then yeah, they'd probably drink it and they're not going to end up so great. So it'd be nice to have a series of troughs or other ways to provide them water before you turn them back out. And I think that's it. Just a quick recovery on how to manage your livestock on burned areas. That concludes our presentation for the night, but if anyone has any questions,